Open up our Bibles to the book of Joshua and chapter 20. As we open back up, we are really concluding this section of mostly geographical reference. And then the last few chapters will return to some degree of narrative. But as I've already made mention, we want to recognize this is not unimportant by any means. I mean, this is a considerable portion of this book that is devoted to all of these geographical markers. And we've talked about why that's particularly important. As we begin, just want to go ahead and put the map up here again. And let's see here. There we go. All right. Just hit it harder. So this is our map, and we've noted the division of the territories. And remember what's been being said about Levi. God is their inheritance. And it's said it multiple times, right? It's almost like just reminder, as we're going through all the tribes. Let me remind you one more time that the reason Levi's not getting an inheritance here, and it says it, in that first section, we've got Judah, and we've got Ephraim and Manasseh, and the tribes on it says it in that section. Then even as it's doling out the rest of the land, it says it. So it's continually reminding us why Levi's not mentioned. Now today we're going to talk about Levi and all the cities that are devoted to them. That will be the cities that are just Levitical cities, and then also included in that number would be the cities of refuge that we're going to look at. So it would be 48 cities total. 6 of those being the cities of refuge, 42 of those being other cities. This map does have the cities of refuge that are laid out. I think they are underlined here on both sides, Bezer, Ramoth Gilead, and let's see, Kadesh up there, Golan there, and then let's see. So you can see the cities of refuge on this map, but if you look over at this map, this is a piece of software that I have. You just tell it what you're looking for, and cities of refuge and Levitical cities is one of the elements there. All the cities that show a plus sign here are the cities of refuge. And one thing that we've noted on occasion about the cities of refuge is what do you see geographically about the cities of refuge, about their location? Yeah, there's somewhat even dispersion throughout the land of Canaan, both on the east side of the Jordan and on the west side of the Jordan. And why would that be important? Yeah, you don't want to be very far from one if you need one, right? You are trying to get there fast, and it is a mercy that they're not just, that you don't, think of it like, people have to travel to Jerusalem once the temple's there to come and worship. That's not this, right? This is not some devoted journey like that. This is a desperate situation. And so the cities of refuge are dispersed throughout. Now these other cities that are listed here are not all of the cities of Levi. You have to, because if you listed them all, there'd be overlapping names is what would happen. And so on the software, you have to zoom in for more names to appear. So that was kind of hard to depict here. This is as far out as I could zoom and get as many of the cities listed. But just based on what you can see here about where these cities are, where do the cities, both the cities of refuge and then more broadly the cities of the Levites, where do they come from? Where's that territory coming from? Yeah, it's the land of the tribes, right? They're not given their own territory. They're given territory within the tribes, each of the territories of the tribes. One of the things that I think we need to think about as we're looking at this allocation of the land going through chapter 19, starting in chapter 13, going all the way through chapter 19, is that there is a distinction between that land that's being allocated there and these cities being allocated here. that distinction is emphasized, as I already pointed out, by saying the Levites don't get territory, right? So whatever this is not the same as that. Because Joshua is at pains to make sure that we know the difference, that we understand the difference between that and this. So one of the ways I think to think about how the cities of the Levites are being allocated is that after everybody's given their land, then they give land to the Levites, which you see how that would work, right? That's what they do generally, right? They give of their own portions to support the Levites. That includes the land, right? So it's not only from the standpoint of they give on an ongoing basis, but here, right at the beginning, portions of their own territory are carved out to give back. So whereas the initial stages, 13 through 19, is here's this tribe's land, here's this tribe's land, it's sort of now you're going to give back a portion of that to the Levites. And I think that's a good way to think about chapters 20 and 21, is they're giving back their portions for the support of the Levites. And we'll talk more about that as we get on down in the questions a little bit. Okay, now, what's the purpose of the cities of refuge as we're getting into chapter 20 here?
Well, if someone has slain someone unintentionally, an accident, or he struck him, without any malice beforehand, he can flee to the city and plead to the city his case, and then they can take him in, just remain there until the death of the high priest, and then he can return back to his appointed place.
Yeah, to his own native city, yes. All right, so it's to offer refuge. It's a place of refuge, obviously the cities of refuge. It's a place of refuge for someone who is caused to death without intent. Caused to death without intent. Now, as you look through this description here, and it's fairly brief here with these sort of 8 verses, beginning in verse 2 and going down through verse 9, 8 verses of a description here of the cities of refuge. How does this compare with Numbers 35?
There are a lot more details given in Numbers.
Yeah. So just frankly, Numbers goes much farther into detail. There is actually a little bit of detail here that's not given in Numbers, that he comes to the doorway and pleads his case. But for the most part, Numbers gives you a much more thorough explanation of what's going on here. And so I'd like to turn over there to Numbers chapter 35 to bring that into the context to discuss the nature of the cities of refuge. You don't get the thoroughgoing explanation from Joshua because it's already been given, right? This is just a reference in Joshua chapter 20. He's referencing what Moses has already said. So you go back and you can read what Moses has already said. Now, as we look at this more extensive layout here, the cities for the Levites, it's almost like an opposite, right? The cities for the Levites are given 5 verses, and then like 30 verses are given to the cities of refuge in Numbers, and then you almost flip that in Joshua, where you've got these 8 verses given to the cities of refuge, and then you have a very extensive chapter given to the cities devoted to the Levites. Okay, so when you're reading here through these commands about the cities of refuge in Numbers 35, is there anything that jumps out at you as maybe you hadn't noticed before, or just that helps you understand the nature of what these cities are for and are not for?
Well, the cities are not meant for people that commit crimes, that commit murder, to go get sanctuary and be able to live.
Okay, and as he goes through, he explains what that would be, right? He says, if this city, it's not to protect this guy, and it's not to protect this guy, and so, You don't just come and if you make it in the city, you're good. Now, incidentally, in historical terms, religious places have been viewed as places of sanctuary, and literally anybody can go in there and claim sanctuary. That's not this. You can go do that until a trial happens. And then if you're found guilty, you don't get to just claim, it would be very similar. One of the commands about God's altar is that you are not to slay anyone before the altar. Well, what do you see people do then, for instance, in the beginning reign of Solomon? Yeah, grab the horns of the altar. This is going to protect me because you can't kill me while I'm grabbing hold of the altar. They're like, it's a loophole that they're looking. This is not a loophole. That's not what this, and God makes clear that's not what this is going to be. This is in order to actually get at the facts of the case, and gives a long enough reprieve to get at those facts, and then we'll see what to do going forward. But let me add to that. As he talks about what is not manslaughter, which is a term that we have in our own judicial system, our definition is not precisely the same as it's laid out here. What do you think are some distinctions that are made about manslaughter here that may not be in our case?
Well, here, if he takes an implement that's really, I think, other than like his fist, a metal, stone, or a wooden implement, regardless, it's considered murder.
Yes. So there's an implement, but then also it says in verse 20, if he pushed him out of hatred or threw something at him, lying in wait as a result, and he died. Or if he struck him down with his hand in enmity, and as a result, he died. The one who struck him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. Now, I think one of the things that you'll find in our own judicial system is that if you maybe even had malice, but you did not intend to kill someone, then there's room for a manslaughter charge, because even though you did mean to do harm, but you didn't mean for this, and you pushed someone, you got into a fight and pushed them down and so forth, and maybe some freak accident, they fell on something and they died, then that's going to be manslaughter or even less, maybe. In this case, what's the charge? If you're angry with somebody, you're hateful, you push them down, you don't mean to kill them, but it's as a result they die. What's the charge? Murder. All right? Now, I just think about this from the standpoint of what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5. Isn't there a connection where Jesus shows that it's not just the actual taking of life? In this case, even the actual loss of life, your guilt or innocence, or the nature of your guilt, let me say that, the nature of your guilt is modified based on what you think about that person. Now, that may be hard to prove what you think about that person, but if you're the kind of person who went around saying evil things about this person, I see that on crime procedurals all the time. They're looking into suspects, and man, that person just, boy, they all the time carping about, and so they become a suspect, right? In this case, if it's clear that you hated this person, and then you threw this thing, you say, look, I didn't mean for that to happen. Yeah, but you threw it because you hated them. And so the result is that they died. If I can prove that you threw it, and I can prove that you hated them, I don't have to prove that you meant to kill them. I think that's a difference. That's a difference in their laws and our laws, is that we not only have to prove intent from the standpoint of hatred, but actual intent from the standpoint of I did mean to kill that person. You didn't have to mean to kill that person. Now, one of the things that I think about that, we'll talk more in just a moment as we talk about God's justice and so forth, is that consideration of motives is, I think, something that that gets to the heart of what justice is and what justice isn't, and sort of being swayed, I think, sometimes by people's maybe emotional ties in one direction or another. But I would say then, by looking at this Numbers 35, this extended explanation, then really what we're saying is you truly have to not have intent. Not just not intent to kill, but not intent all the way down to you didn't, you thought no harm towards this person. But if you thought harmful thoughts, communicated those harmful thoughts, and then did something harmful that led to death, you're a murderer. And so would be convicted as such. Now, how would they do the convicting?
In front of the priest, I guess.
Yes, but there's a particular procedure that's mentioned here, or a particular element of the case that's mentioned here. What has to happen in order for somebody to be convicted?
Needs two witnesses.
Needs two witnesses. By 2 or 3 witnesses. This is a critical element of God's justice, is 2 witnesses. Not circumstantial evidence, and it specifies in this case, it says not 1 witness, right? So if 1 witness, you have to have corroborating evidence in order for the person to be put to death, which we would say in our own judicial system, we'd say innocent until proven guilty. Right? So the burden is not for the man to come in and prove himself innocent, but that multiple witnesses must come in, and they got to prove 2 elements. That he did throw the thing or hit him or whatever. They got to prove that. And then they also have to prove the hatred. Right? And those 2 things can be proven. But more than 1 witness, more than a single piece of evidence has to be brought in order to convict this man. It goes on and explains additionally that what is not an option for even the man who's committed manslaughter, not just the murderer, but the man who's committed manslaughter, what cannot be done for him.
You can't take any money to basically bail him out.
No ransom, right? You can't buy freedom in this case. Right? There were other vows and different responsibilities that there was a ransom price for. This is not one of those things. You cannot purchase your way out of it. So even if you're a very wealthy person who's fallen into this situation, there's no other option than to stay in the city of refuge. Marshall?
For those who look at the law and say that it's just so burdensome that they had all these procedures, all these laws, this seems to actually be an act of God's mercy, because if we just have the strict law back in Genesis 9, if any man sheds man's blood, by man his blood will be shed. Now we're getting, well, unless this.
Yes. And that gets into our next question, which is, how does this speak to God's justice and mercy? One of the elements of God's mercy is that he is giving a more nuanced explanation of shedding man's blood, because it would be very easy for especially the avenger of blood to just interpret Genesis 9 and say, hey, look, he shed my brother's blood. That's case closed. And God says, wait a minute, there's more to it than that. Now, what else does it say about God's justice and mercy? These cities of refuge.
Well, that he is merciful and he is just. And he knows what's best for his people.
Yes, absolutely. Jacob?
Well, it occurs to me, we don't have an exact timeline of how long the trial will have taken place. But overall, you get the impression this is a very urgent situation that needs to be taken care of. In our justice system today, cases will last for a year or more frequently, to where the punishment almost becomes separated from the crime. But here, it's like, if you commit this, it's manslaughter or murder, the avenger of blood is on you right away. You need to go to a city of refuge, get this taken care of, get this sorted out immediately.
Yeah, and I would say not just the case, I mean, a year or more would be optimistic, actually, in most cases. Have you ever seen a situation where somebody's got the death penalty, maybe here in Alabama, and that gets some headlines? Do you see when they committed the crime? Yeah. Usually it's like they were in their 20s, now they're in their 50s, as they're actually coming face to face with the consequences of that crime. That's ridiculous. That's not just. And so there is, as you say, an urgency to get to the bottom of this. And so that is just. Kevin?
Also, even if you are completely innocent and did not mean to kill him, you lose a lot of your life being imprisoned in the city because you did shed blood.
Yes,
There's
so-
still some punishment for even the accidental murder. Life has value.
Yeah, I would say there is a consequence. I hesitate to refer to the cities of refuge as a refuge, as punishment, because I think they are refuge. They are protection, and I don't want to then point to them as something that's the opposite, punishment. There's a consequence though. You do lose a degree of freedom. I gather that you wouldn't be in shackles here in this place. I gather that you would have freedom within the city, but that you would lose some, obviously, considerable degree of your freedom. I want to be clear. The cities of refuge are not prisons. In fact, I think it is instructive as we read through God's perfect law that you do not see a prison system. What you see is crimes and punishments. You see crimes committed, you see judgment rendered, and you see penalties paid. That can be anything from financial penalty to a physical corporal penalty to the death penalty. But what you don't see is 20 years becoming an even worse person as you embitter yourself in some cell somewhere, at society's expense, incidentally. I think that prison systems are, in so many ways, an opportunity for the abuse of justice. Now, don't mishear me. What I don't mean is that I think that they are overly harsh. I think they are simply unjust. I think penalties should be exacted and people should either be able to move on with their life or lose their life. And one of those two paths. But we don't have a category for that. We just sock people away, out of sight, out of mind, and I think a lot of problems come from that. And I think from the standpoint of if we're looking to God for guidance, you would see just a much different path as far as how to handle those sorts of things. That sort of retaining someone in some sort of prison or something should be brief, and until a trial can happen, until consequences can be exacted. Tony?
Right. A jail, a prison in our day is punishment, but it can also be thought of as protection for that criminal, protected from the angry mobs.
Right.
Well, that's the same way the city of refuge was a city of protection for him. So not punishment
Yes.
as much as protection for him.
Right. Think more Atticus Finch sitting outside the jailhouse. Cody?
Some of that language is kind of spoken of in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 and verse 11 that Jacob spoke about. It says, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. So it speaks of the time between the crime and the punishment.
Yeah, and it's not just that it lingers for the prisoner, but what about the person who's wanting the justice? It produces what Ecclesiastes is talking about, so much bitterness that there's not that sense of justice. Now, the other thing I would say about God's justice here, and it gets to the points here, is that God, to the point Kevin was making, God takes seriously the loss of life however it happens. And the phrase he uses here in Numbers 35 is, the land is polluted. This is language that is used throughout the Old Testament, throughout the prophets. We don't use much anymore, right? Like something has to be done about this. The very land is crying out for something to be done, and God is not leaving crimes unaddressed. He's not leaving the loss of life unaddressed. And so, two elements there. First of all, you've got the person whose relative has been killed, right? In some way, their relative has been killed. What do you think their feeling is? If your brother, your wife, your daughter, your son has been killed for whatever reason, what do you want?
Justice.
You want justice. And so God says, I'll give you an opportunity for that. Now, the avenger of blood here is given that room, basically, if you can get to him. But from the standpoint of the man running to the city, I don't think it's just that this is a foot race, right? In other words, you're both standing in a field, you kill someone, the other guy's right there, and now the race is on. I think it's more of, don't take this lightly. You get there and you get there now, right? The more likely scenario would be that you kill, a family member finds out, and now he begins a pursuit. You should have plenty of time to get there, right? And so I don't want us to have in our minds that God's like, well, just see who's fastest. I think more it's he wants the person who has taken the life to take that very seriously. And so he leaves that open. Now, as far as the avenger of blood, would we call this mere revenge? I know he uses the word avenger, but would we call this mere revenge?
Well, it is justice.
It is justice. Same as eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That there are limitations, there are prescriptions. God is not introducing, as we might say, the Wild West here. He is saying, here's how this will proceed. This is what this will look like. And he isn't just saying, well, let's throw it out there and see what happens. No, God is giving all the procedures. And so in all of this, I want us to appreciate the order and justice that God is introducing, both justice and opportunity for mercy. All of that we're being educated in all of that by looking at the cities of refuge. Now, one more element there. When does he get to leave? Sam mentioned it earlier. The high priest, when the high priest dies. In verse 26, let me see here. No, verse 25. The congregation shall deliver the manslayer from the hand of the blood avenger, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge, shall restore him to the city of refuge from which he fled, or to which he fled, and he shall live in it until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the holy oil. Now, what do you think that word anointed? We've talked about it before. What do you think that word anointed is?
Messiah.
Yeah. All right. So the high priest who was Messiah with holy oil until he shall die. And then your blood guiltiness shall be taken away and you can go back to your city. Do you think that has any significance? That the high priest, who is Messiah, dies and you are freed from the blood guiltiness that brought you into that place in the first place. Yeah, I think there is a pointing forward. And as we're sitting here going, why that? Yeah, I think it's pointing forward, and it's communicating something about the death of a high priest and what the meaning of the death of a high priest, so that when we get to Jesus and we see all the significance of his death, here is one more way to think about it. Just add this on to the very long list of all the significances of Jesus' death. All right. Any other thoughts on that, on the cities of refuge before we move on? Paul?
It just strikes me that God could have made cities of refuge be in each tribe, of that tribe, but it's the Levi cities. And I wonder if there's some of God's mercy there too, right? Because they've lost the freedom to live on their family land, and they have to go to one of these Levitical cities. Well, who's the inheritance of the Levites? It's God. You know, this was the time to dedicate themselves to God more.
Yes, yeah. So there is, along with the loss of freedom, there is a certain degree of privilege that they could have enjoyed as they live among the Levites in their city. One more element about that, who all did this apply to?
Stranger or the Israelite.
Anybody, right? So the law, as always, applies to everybody living in the land of Israel. That everybody could take part in all the responsibilities and the privileges that were of justice and mercy that were afforded to Israel. So even the sojourner and the stranger among them could find refuge. Okay, now, beginning in chapter 21, we go on to, chapter 20. No, chapter 21. Sorry, I was sitting there looking for the reference. I'm over in Judges. Chapter 21, now we have the layout of the cities of the Levites. And each of the tribes is being mentioned, right? As the cities are named, it's from this tribe and from this tribe and from this tribe. And so all the tribes are donating land to the cause, as we said before. It doesn't tell all the reasons, I think, that these cities are scattered out. But from the standpoint of what we can know and what we can, I think, reasonably speculate, why are these cities being scattered throughout the land?
There's sacrifices to be offered.
Pardon?
There's regularly scheduled sacrifices to be offered.
Okay. All right, there's teaching to be done. We'll come back to that one in just a minute.
Well, I was going to say, so the Levites could be scattered throughout the land.
All right, so Levites, yeah, so you could disperse the priesthood. Marshall?
And this seems to be somewhat of a redemption story because of their anger, Jacob had prophesied that they would be scattered in Genesis 49, and now, because of their zeal for God, maybe at Mount Sinai, now they get an inheritance that is not a punishment.
Yeah, I love this. All right, so first thing is that in their anger, right? Remember Judah. Remember why Judah gets this place of preeminence. It's because of the failure of the first sons, Levi being one of those. And in anger, he is given something of a curse, and there's a scattering that's prophesied. But when you look at how that plays out, and as Marshall said, maybe this is because of their zeal at Mount Sinai with the story of the golden calf, that as they take up this role, there ends up being almost a blessing in that scattering. And so like so many curses, they don't have to be received as curses, right? So there is a scattering, but maybe it doesn't end up being as bitter as it sounds when Jacob pronounces that as he's going through blessing his sons. All right, another thing, just very practical, they're being given land that they can live on and work and produce. And not only are these cities, but what does it say additionally about those cities? About the land. Yeah, they're given land around the cities, right? And so very clearly it's land for animals and crops and so forth that they would be able to get produce from and be able to live on. So in addition to all the support that they ought to be given from the children of Israel, they would be able to supplement and produce of their own land. Now, it was never supposed to be the case that burden of providing for themselves was supposed to fall entirely on them. And what we see later on in the prophets, as they're restoring Israel, is that what was happening is they weren't supplying for the needs, and they were having to only work the land, right? They're having to take up all their time working that in order to just provide for themselves. And so one of the correctives that's offered is that they need to supply the needs of the Levitical priesthood. All right. Coming back, though, to the instructive element. All right? Can't remember, Brent, did you say? Yeah, the instructive element. There, the law does not spend a great deal of time on this. Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 10 says, you shall instruct the people. Obviously, there's the reading of the law every 7 years at least. But I will say one thing that you can see is every time there's a reform, every time there's a restoration, it's the Levites who are called up to go and instruct the people. You see it with Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles chapter 17, that he sends the Levites throughout the territory to go and re-educate the people about the law. Nehemiah, of course, calls up the Levites to go and instruct the people. And maybe most clear is Malachi chapter 2 and verse 7, which basically says the Levites should have been doing this, right? It ought to have been the job that they were engaged in, and they weren't, right? Because Malachi is about failures. So I do think we can take all of that and we can understand then that one of the elements of the Levitical tribe is that they are the keepers of the law. They are the teachers of the law. And there is just a practical element of having the teachers of the law throughout the territory, right? In all the tribal territories, and so that there would be an easy access, right, to that education of the law. Now, I asked this question, how does that compare to the Messianic kingdom?
Churches are sort of like cities of refuge, might say, or cities of the Levites. We
Yeah.
are scattered throughout a secular world and have the opportunity to teach those around.
Yes, right. And so there is that element of that we ought to be those beacons. We ought to be those places, the keepers of the law. That we are the pillars and ground of truth, that we hold it up and people can come and learn of it here and learn of it from the people who dwell here. Now, what other comparisons or contrasts might we make to the Messianic kingdom?
Well, the same thing, except the priests are still the keepers of the law. You just said it.
Yes. And we are a kingdom of priests, right? So 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, that we are a royal priesthood. Now, I would make this point. In Exodus chapter 19 and verse 6, God says Israel ought to be a kingdom of priests. What do you think God means by that? When we often make the point, we are a kingdom of priests, they had a separate class of priests.
The rest of the nations around Israel were supposed to come to know God through Israel's example.
Yes. So while the priests were the educators, everybody was supposed to know. And they ought to have been priests to the whole world, right? If you came in contact with an Israelite anywhere, you ought to have learned about God. Is there any place where you see that happening? I think of Naaman. He learned about God through a little Israelite girl who was a servant. She represents, I think, what God means in Exodus chapter 19 and verse 6, a kingdom of priests. Here she comes as a servant into a foreign nation, a happenstance contact, and this great man of Syria learns about the one true God because he came in contact with an Israelite. That ought to be what that's about. All right, we'll finish up this lesson and continue on with the next on Wednesday.